performance and characterization of a low-cost open source CPC, which is something that I think is very, very interesting. So, Aaron, take the floor.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about an open source condensation particle counter we've been working on called, we love it when we call it the OpenCPC. So we're going to talk through a little bit about what is the OpenCPC project, talk about how we calibrate the OpenCPC. It's a little different than a traditional CPC. Go through some performance data, and talk about long-term operation in high humidity environments, which is kind of interesting given the working fluid we're using. So the question you might ask me is, why create an OpenCPC? And we believe that clean air is a human right. And so what we want to do is create solutions that are accessible at a global level, they're deployed equitably, and we can do it in timescales that matter, that can have an influence on the world around us. And we believe that open source hardware is one tool to help do that. We also believe that you can't fix what you don't measure. So when we think about regulatory framework, if you have limited access to tools, then there's limited access to be able to regulate them as well. And the other belief is that we want to get aerosol science happening outside of aerosol science conversations like here. Although I love y'all and I'm excited to be here, I want other people to have access to these tools to think about how they might measure, how they might do measurements that might influence public health and other considerations like environmental effects. So what is the OpenCPC layout? So we're using a classic laminar flow force convection design. It's just a tube in a tube. We're using a working fluid that's a little atypical that you don't see too often. We're using 2-propanol or isopropyl alcohol. In our system, we use a lensless scattered light collection system along with a focused laser module. It's also made out of plastic, and because of that, we can't heat it as well. And so we use a technique with a bypass flow. So if you look at the inlet, we bring in 0.35 liters per minute of flow, and we separate some of that through a filter. We measure the temp, the absolute pressure, and the relative humidity of that. And then we channel that bypass flow through the saturator to heat it up a little bit. In the latest version this year, we decided to skip the condenser because we were just kind of wasting energy cooling it back down. And then we reintroduced that flow into the optics to dilute the isopropyl alcohol that's coming out of the nozzle. And what that does is it actually prevents condensation happening inside the optics. So some people heat them to stop the condensation, we just dilute it. And we operate at a temperature difference of 10 degrees C. So one thing that's unique about the OpenCPC is that we use a focused laser beam. So a traditional CPC will have a very wide laser beam that's larger than the nozzle. So as particles traverse there, there's distribution plots of pulse height. And what we see is that for a traditional beam, that all the particles will get fairly uniform pulse amplitude. But when you have a focused beam, some of the particles don't pass through the beam at all. Some are passing near the edge of the beam. And so you get a very wide distribution of pulse heights. And we actually kind of measured that in real life with some 3.1 micron PSL and got similar results. So this creates a challenge because some particles never go through the beam. So we created a method to deal first with particle size differences that also happen. We created a method, or basically kind of developed a method called the threshold count ratio. Basically, when you have this pulse height distribution that you see here, what we do is we create a summary statistic. You could do a curve fit, it's kind of more complicated, so we just use a summary statistic. We draw a line in the sand, and we call that our threshold. And basically, we bin all the counts have pulses above that threshold. We call them above threshold counts. And for pulses that are smaller than the threshold, we bin them in a below threshold count. And then the threshold count ratio is just the above threshold divided by the below. And I worked on a theoretical model in Octave, which is an open source version of MATLAB, to try to figure out what the count fraction would be as you change particle size. So I created a Monte Carlo simulation where I changed the gain, the amplification, the particle size ranging from 2 to 20 micron, and large range in geometric standard deviation. And as you look at count fraction and use the threshold, it coalesces into a fairly linear line with kind of becomes indeterminate near zero. I didn't believe that data because it seemed way too convenient. And so I took a little experiment last year to try to recreate that by creating a wide range of particle sizes by changing things like the concentration, the saturator and condenser temperatures to grow the particles bigger or smaller, our amplification, and I tested a couple different laser powers. And we got a fairly linear plot, although there is quite a bit of noise on there. This year we figured out, well, you can make a 10 micron particle look like a 1 micron particle by just turning down the laser power. So we bought an adjustable laser, and that allows us to very accurately move the laser power up and down, which effectively simulates different size particles by just lowering the scatter light intensity because the beam is less intense. And that we got a nice, beautiful linear plot where we can now characterize fractional efficiency depending on this threshold count ratio. So think of threshold count ratio as basically like particle size, but we don't quite have enough information to figure that out. So how do we calibrate the OpenCPC? Well, first we self-calibrate to itself, because it can count, and we can change that laser power up and down, and it can start to calibrate to itself. How many is it counting at a high count threshold? So in this example, we're nearly at unity at a ratio of about 2.2, and as I lower that laser power, it starts counting less. But that's just a relative measure. I need to gauge this thing now to some calibrated reference standard. So we use a reference CPC along with using a sodium iodide aerosol, which I highly recommend. There's a nice paper I put in the bottom that really helps issues around cut point issues when you're calibrating two CPCs together. And so then we get our reference. So we have like we have their self-reference value, so it knows what it is doing relative to itself, but we need a global reference, and so we tie it to another CPC that's full flow, and it counts all the particles. And then we just scale the count fraction curve to what you see there. So basically we went from 100%, we know we have a scale factor of 0.108 at, let's say, a TCR of 1, and then we just scale the curve. So that worked really well, or at least it should, right? Okay, so we did it with 6 CPCs doing that same calibration method, and we referenced against a 3025A using, again, the sodium iodide aerosol. And it looks great on the one-to-one plot because that's always fun and easy to do, but I like to push it a little further, so let's plot that in error because it's, I think, more relevant. And you see some kind of interesting trends. So the first is, you notice on the low end of the count, we have quite a bit of error, and we'll talk a little bit about what can drive that. In the kind of the range of about 1,000 to 10,000 particles per cc, we have really pretty tight accuracy there with about plus or minus 6% error. And then as we continue up, we start to see it rolling off a little bit. And so we'll talk a little bit on the low end first. What's going on there? We made a mistake. We totalized for 30 seconds in all of these experiments. And if you, as we heard in an earlier talk, random error associated with count statistics really dominates. And so we just have very few counts in the low bins. And so those error bars represent the counting, the count statistics, the 95% count interval based on those count statistics. So as you can see, we get to higher counts. They start to coalesce, but we still have that drop on the high end. And if you're paying attention, you're gonna say, Aaron, use the 3025A. It itself has coincidence. So you're only really comparing the relative coincidence of these two devices, and you are correct. So to overcome that, we add a diluter in front of the 3025A. So we had a 20-to-1 dilution. What this does is it brings the 3025A to be now in a region where coincidence is pretty negligible, but we can still have our OpenCPC at a high concentration. And here we see, okay, yeah, that roll-off's really happening. And what we see is about at 100,000 particles per cc, we have about 10% coincidence. And as we go up to about 200,000 particles or 250,000 particles per cc, we're starting to get 25, 30% coincidence. So definitely have coincidence issues at high concentration, but so far that is still fairly functional for the concentration range of interest. Another important parameter for these devices is the cut point. So we used a tungsten wire generator along with an anode DMA to create a test aerosol. And here we ran that test aerosol through a wide range of sizes, fit a curve to it, and at our 10 degree delta T, we achieved a 50% cut point at 10.4 nanometers. I do want to note for full transparency that we did scale these values by 1.09 because we had a slight disagreement between the OpenCPC and the electrometer that we used at TSI 3068B. Zero count, another important part of CPCs. Are you counting real stuff or are you making particles? So we just hooked an ULPA filter to the OpenCPC and operated it for 24 hours continuously. And for the 24-hour average, we ended up with 5 times 10 to the minus 4. There was this region of some counts. So if we kind of look at the worst case conditions, we saw in 1 hour, 3 times 10 to the minus 3, a half an hour increment, 7 times 10 to the 3. And the worst case was this narrow 19-minute window. And so we're gonna say, hey, that's the worst we are at 1.2, or sorry, 1 times 10 to the minus 2 on a 0 count. Response time, another important parameter of a CPC. In this case, we just used a pneumatic switching valve to do this. So in this, there is still some dead time associated with the valve, but we use it as is, and so it's likely to be less than this. And for both the rise time and the fall time, we're less than 3 seconds response time. Okay, so one of the things that is really important to talk about is why don't people use isopropyl alcohol often? Well, it has a problem that it absorbs water vapor and it's fully miscible. So with butanol, if you absorb water into the butanol, it'll eventually phase separate. You'll have butanol on the top and the water will sit on the bottom. But isopropyl alcohol is fully miscible, meaning you can have 1% water or 99% water. And our original concept in our design was to prevent water vapor condensation happening in the condenser. So think about your Coke can on a cold day, it starts condensing water vapor. Well, what if we just make sure that we condense isopropyl and not the water so we don't ever have this water issue? And so we'll just measure the dew point coming in, we'll set our condenser to be 1 degree above that so it never condenses the water, and life's great. We were wrong. There's a problem called preferential evaporation. The air coming in has water vapor present, the humidity. And what happens in these mixtures is that there's already water vapor in the air. And so if you have any water in your isopropyl alcohol, it doesn't prefer, it stays in, but all the alcohol exits. And so this is a nice paper from a German study where they took a bath of water, or a bath of isopropyl alcohol, and flowed humid air over it, and it's evaporating. And that concentration of the bath over time varied. If you started at 100% IPA and flowed it for a few minutes, that the concentration of the bath would go from 100% IPA to 100% water, which kind of blew my mind. And we saw a similar effect of what was happening in our CPC too. So what the real solution to that is that you have to reduce the RH in your condenser, and so one way to do that is to elevate its temperature. So what we discovered is that one solution to do this is to just elevate the condenser temperature to be 6.5 degrees C above the dew point, so you just need extra margin. And then your saturator sits 10 degrees above that. And so we did some testing on that. We had a very fortunate or unfortunate day, depending on how you look at it, a record high dew point in Minnesota on August 26th. It was very humid. And so we scrambled because we heard about it on the news, and we're like, all right, let's get our CPC outside with this 6.5 degree offset operation. And we ran it for 4 hours with a 3025A inside as a reference on a diffusion dryer. And the diffusion dryer is there to make sure that the butanol on the 3025A doesn't have the same issue with water vapor condensation. And we operated for 4 hours, so we see fairly consistent response from the counts from both devices. And on the bottom plot, the blue line is the dew point over that 4-hour window, and the red line is that TCR, that threshold count ratio. And what you see is it's consistent over that entire run. And again, TCR is like droplet size. We don't know exactly what it is because we don't have a nice reference to that, but you can view that. So lower TCR means smaller, or bigger TCR means bigger particles. Most importantly, it's stable for that 4-hour run. But we're not happy with just 4 hours. We want it to run longer. So we decided to set up for a 7-day continuous test with the same thing. This time we brought them all inside because we wanted to run it for a week and it might rain outside. So we took one CPC to give it the worst case condition. We hooked it to a water bath and ran at 100% RH for 7 days. So it's just choking on a humid water bath. And the other two reference CPCs we attached to a diffusion dryer so that they were operating at nearly dry conditions, and we operated it continuously for 7 days. This is the plot of the concentration of these 3 devices. And what we found is that over that entire week, that device operating with the water bath continued to operate fine. So it highlighted that this little 6.5 degree C delta that we're running seems to be sufficient to prevent water condensation in the system. So, conclusion. So, kind of hopefully presented some good data to make the argument that the OpenCPC is capable of concentration range from 0.1 to 100,000 particles per cc, with this upper limit right now being somewhat limited by coincidence. That we think that plus or minus 20% count accuracy over the range is achievable given our calibration method. We have a cut point of about 10.4 nanometers for a tungsten aerosol, response time less than 3 seconds, and that the use of this RH measurement technique to control the condenser temperature with a 6.5 degree C margin is sufficient for isopropyl alcohol-based systems to operate continuously in high humidity environments. So thanks to everyone that helped, and hopefully some good questions.